So I want to talk about setting up a document in InDesign. And when you launch InDesign, it's going to give you this kind of intro screen. And on this side, I could hit Create New, or I could go up to File, New Document. So really, you could do it either way. I'm going to hit Create New because I do want to show you some of the options that are within this window. Along the top, it says recent, so these are going to be recent files that you've used, saved files. These are print, so just kind of general sizes. So you'll notice there's business card style size here, letter legal, which is 8.5 by 14, tabloid, which is like our standard poster size, which is 11 by 17, and then there's letter half. So I can click on any of these and it'll actually change the sizes for me off to this right side. You always want to make sure you're in inches. Some people use these others. Sometimes people will say, hey, set up your file in, 1280 by 780 picas or points or whatever it might be. So you can switch it and type that in and then switch it back to inches and it'll convert it for you. So for example, I can go 1280 picas and it changed it for me to whatever the height was that I had plugged in, or I can go back to inches and then you'll notice that it switches it for me to inches. And of course, I can click on any of these at any time and it'll change it. This is the orientation. Do you want it portrait or do you want it landscape, which is more of that horizontal variation? And then how many pages is this going to be? So if we're working on one poster, it's one page. If we're working on a magazine, it's going to be something closer to an 8.5 by 11, not 8.5 by 11, but closer. And it might be 3 pages. And if we're working on something that you want the pages to be facing each other, then of course you want this selected. If we're working on a poster and we're doing 2 posters, we do not want them to be facing. We want individual pages. I would just ignore this. You can set up your columns here. I never do because I don't really know what my columns are going to look like yet until I get into the document. You can set up your margins here. 1/2 inch is a great place to start depending on what it is that you're doing. Don't go too small. 1/4 is kind of small. I would start here and you can always adjust. If you drop down the bleed and slug, bleed is any elements that bleed to the edge of the paper, you actually need them to bleed to the bleed mark, not just to the edge. So I'll show you that here in a second. So we'll set an 1/8 is usually what printers ask for. Some ask for 1/4, so I typically set it to 1/4. And there's a little chain over here saying that these are all tied to each other, but if you unlink it, I could set my bottom margin to be a little bit larger, which on the magazine, I personally prefer the bottom to be a little bit bigger of a margin. Slug I've probably used once, and what this means is it's where you can write a note to the printer. So I'll put a 3-inch on the left side and I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so here's our document. So if I were making a PDF, this slug area over here, kind of noted by the blue, would show up. So I could actually do a text box and put a note in here. So I just put the word note, but I could write something to the vendor and that could be included. I rarely use that. I can also go and turn that off. So if I go back to File, Document Setup, Bleed and Slug, and I can just take this back to 0 and say, okay, now it's gone. So this pinkish purple area within your page, that's your margin. And you can change it once you're in here under Layout, Margins and Columns, and you can change it, watch it get bigger. Also you can change your columns here, but that's really just columns for, that just kind of gives you a baseline. So like, for example, it's just showing you if you were to split your page, that's what the 2 columns would look like. So I would just leave that as 1 column. If I had an image that was bleeding off the top, so let's say I had some kind of big header image that was right here, I would not want it to just go to the edge. I need to pull it all the way off the page to the bleed area. So if I were printing this, then the vendor would actually trim it or I would trim it. But if you miss at all, then you don't see white. So if I have this just to the edge and I miss trimming, I'm going to see white because I didn't give myself any room for error. So that's why you want it to bleed off the edge. Your text, you do not want your text to go beyond that margin area, any of the margins that you have set. The only way you'd want it to go off is if you had some kind of a, I'm just going to write the word hello, but let's just say that this was really more for design than anything else. It really wasn't about reading it. So maybe I have this like this, maybe I have the transparency down, and I bleed this into this area beyond the margin, and it even is going off the page. That's perfectly fine because this isn't about reading it. It's more just about using it as a design element. But all your basic text you want to keep within this margin area. It helps your eye to be able to move around. So that's really helpful. So that's your basic document setup, and make sure that you're hitting File, Save. You don't need to hit Save As unless you already have a version saved and you're trying to save another version. Nomenclature for our department, last name, first initial, underscore. What class is this for? So I'm going to say it's for InDesign, underscore. And then what is this? Is it assignment 1, formatting, or whatever it might be? So I can even just call this document setup, and then I would save it wherever that's going to be. You want to save it as your regular InDesign file, InDesign 2020. An IDML file is that file that is for a later, an earlier version. So like if I send my file to somebody who doesn't necessarily have Creative Cloud but has an older version, they can open that IDML file and it's still going to work. So then you're just going to hit save and you'll notice here it is. So that's your basic document setup for InDesign.